My name is Emily Carter, and I'm 34 years old. If you'd met me 7 years ago, you probably would have said I had the perfect life. I was happily married, close to my father, and lucky enough to work for the company he'd spent 3 decades building from a tiny warehouse into one of the most respected logistics firms in Illinois. Despite being the owner's daughter, I never wanted special treatment. I earned my position in the operations department just like everyone else. Dad always said respect wasn't inherited, it was earned. Then I married Daniel. He was charming, patient, and somehow knew exactly what to say to everyone. My father trusted him almost immediately. My mother-in-law, Patricia, seemed equally welcoming, constantly reminding me that marriage meant two families becoming one. At first, her requests sounded harmless. Emily, your cousin-in-law just graduated. Could your dad interview him? A few months later, it became another recommendation. Then another. Patricia always had someone hardworking who simply needed an opportunity. My father believed in helping good people, so he rarely refused. Every applicant arrived with polished resumes, glowing references, and impressive interviews. Within a few years, familiar last names quietly appeared across different departments. Whenever I mentioned how many of Daniel's relatives seemed to be joining the company, Patricia would laugh. "That's what family does," she'd say. "We lift each other up." Daniel always agreed. I wanted to believe them. But one afternoon, while walking through the headquarters, I noticed something strange. 3 newly hired managers, all connected to Daniel's family, stopped talking the moment I entered the room. They smiled. But the silence that followed stayed with me long after I walked away. 6 years passed faster than I ever imagined. By then, 27 employees connected to Daniel's family worked throughout my father's company. They weren't all close relatives. Some were cousins, some were family friends, others had married into the family. But together, they occupied positions that quietly gave them influence over almost everything. Human resources, purchasing, payroll, warehouse supervision, administration. Individually, nothing looked unusual. Together, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Around the same time, something else started happening. Employees who had worked beside my father for 15 or 20 years began resigning. Every goodbye sounded the same. "I just think it's time for a change." Yet none of them looked happy while saying it. At the same time, longtime suppliers were suddenly replaced by companies I'd never heard of. Despite sales reaching record numbers, profit reports somehow looked weaker every quarter. During executive meetings, Dad looked more frustrated than I'd ever seen him, but no one could explain why. Whenever I asked Daniel if he noticed the changes, he barely looked up from his phone. "Emily, you're overthinking everything." If I mentioned it to Patricia, she'd smile and pat my hand. "You worry too much, sweetheart. Successful companies change. That's normal." Maybe they were right. Maybe I was imagining connections that didn't exist. But my instincts refused to stay quiet. Instead of arguing, I started keeping notes. Dates, names, hiring announcements, department transfers, vendor changes. Nothing dramatic, just facts. I didn't know whether those pages would ever matter. Then one Friday evening, Daniel came home unusually calm. He sat across from me, folded his hands, and said the words I never expected to hear. "I think it's time we ended this marriage." In that moment, I realized the company wasn't the only thing quietly changing behind my back. The divorce moved forward so smoothly that it almost felt rehearsed. There were no dramatic arguments, no endless negotiations. Daniel didn't fight over the house or ask for more money. He simply wanted everything finished as quickly as possible. At the time, I thought he was trying to avoid more pain. Looking back, I think he just wanted me gone before I started asking the right questions. The morning our divorce became official, I walked out of the courthouse feeling strangely calm. For the first time in years, I wasn't worried about upsetting my husband or creating tension with his family. I got into my car, picked up my phone, and called my father. "Dad," I said, taking a deep breath. "I need to tell you something I've been keeping to myself for years." He was silent. Then he quietly answered, "I've been waiting for this call." For nearly an hour, I shared every concern I'd written in my notebooks. The unusual hiring, The department transfers. The vendor changes. The growing influence of Daniel's relatives inside the company. When I finally finished, Dad let out a long sigh. I saw pieces of it, he admitted. But I trusted Daniel, and I trusted that if something was truly wrong, you'd tell me. I wanted to, I whispered. I just didn't want my marriage to become a battlefield. It already was, he replied gently. That afternoon, Dad authorized an internal audit led by the company's compliance team and outside legal advisors. Within days, the reports revealed a troubling pattern. The same 27 employees had repeatedly approved one another's hiring recommendations, purchasing requests, promotions, and vendor decisions. Many actions technically followed company policy, but together, they created an unhealthy concentration of influence that no responsible business could ignore. Dad closed the report, looked at me, and quietly reached for the phone. The following Monday, the company looked normal from the outside. Employees filled the parking lot. Delivery trucks rolled through the gates. Forklifts moved pallets across the warehouse floor. Then 8 o'clock arrived. One by one, access badges stopped working. Managers who had spent years approving each other's decisions suddenly found themselves standing outside secured offices, confused and demanding answers. Inside the building, the human resources team, accompanied by company attorneys, began scheduled meetings that had been carefully prepared over the weekend. Every employment decision followed company policy. Every conversation was documented. Every employee was treated professionally and respectfully. This wasn't revenge. It was a business restructuring based on the findings of an independent audit. By noon, the company had already appointed experienced interim managers and restored oversight to departments that had gradually fallen under the same circle of influence. Around 6 that evening, someone pounded on my front door. I didn't have to look through the window. I already knew who it was. Patricia. The moment I opened the door, she exploded. How could you do this to our family? You've destroyed people's lives. I didn't raise my voice. I simply looked at her and said, No, Patricia. Your family made choices. My father protected his company. She laughed bitterly. You planned this the moment you divorced Daniel. Before I could answer, my father stepped onto the porch behind me. He calmly held up a folder. The audit documented years of coordinated hiring recommendations, approval chains, and conflicts of interest, he said. No one was removed because their family. Decisions were made because the company needed independent leadership again. For the first time since I'd known her, Patricia had nothing to say. She stared at the folder, then turned around and walked away without another word. 6 months later, the company felt like itself again. The atmosphere was lighter. Departments communicated openly. Projects that had stalled for months finally moved forward, and employee surveys reflected something my father hadn't seen in years: renewed trust. Several longtime employees who had left during the previous years even reached out about returning. Some accepted new positions, while others simply called to say they were glad the company had found its footing again. One evening, Dad and I stayed late after work, sitting in the conference room overlooking the warehouse. I should have asked more questions, he said quietly. I smiled. We both should have. He nodded before adding, We'll never confuse trust with accountability again. Those words stayed with me. Looking back, I don't think the divorce destroyed my life. It uncovered the truth that had been hiding behind polite smiles, family dinners, and promises of loyalty. For years, I'd mistaken keeping the peace for protecting the people I loved. In reality, silence had only protected the wrong people. Today, I'm no longer someone's wife. I'm a daughter who rebuilt her relationship with her father, an employee who helped restore integrity to a company, and a woman who finally learned that real family never asks you to ignore your instincts. Sometimes freedom doesn't arrive with celebration. Sometimes it arrives inside an envelope marked Final Divorce Decree. And, surprisingly, that was the day my real life finally began.